Tund didn't think the ocean could be this angry. Waves as tall as buildings crashed against the little fishing boat, tossing it like a child's toy. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and the rain fell so hard it stung his skin. The captain of the boat, a wiry man who hadn't said much since they left the mainland, yelled something, but his voice was lost in the roar of the storm. Tund grabbed the edge of the boat, knuckles white, praying under his breath. This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to be heading toward the Niger Delta, following a lead about a human trafficking syndicate that had been terrorizing coastal towns. For weeks, Tund had been chasing whispers and rumors, hoping to uncover the truth and expose the criminals behind the operations. But now it seemed the ocean had other plans. A massive wave hit the boat from the side, and Tund felt himself lifted into the air before slamming back down onto the slippery deck. His chest burned from the salt water he'd swallowed. He scrambled to his feet, but the boat was already leaning, tilting dangerously. He heard a crack, a sound so loud it cut through the storm, and knew the boat was breaking apart. "Jump!" the captain screamed, his face a mask of panic. "Save yourself!" Tund hesitated for a moment, clutching the edge of the boat as if letting go would mean letting go of life itself. But another wave hit, and this time he had no choice. The force of the water threw him overboard, plunging him into the icy depths. The ocean swallowed him whole. Tund didn't remember much after that. He woke up face down on a sandy beach, coughing up seawater. Every muscle in his body ached, and his head felt like it had been used as a drum. For a moment, he just lay there, breathing in the salty air, too tired to move. The sound of waves lapping against the shore was almost soothing, a cruel reminder of the chaos he'd just survived. Slowly, he rolled onto his back, squinting up at the bright sun. The storm was gone, leaving the sky clear and blue. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, a strange contrast to the cold fear still gripping his chest. He was alive, that much was clear. But where was he? Tund forced himself to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. He looked around. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, bordered by a dense forest of tall trees and tangled vines. There was no sign of the fishing boat or the captain. Just him alone, on this strange and empty island. Or so he thought. As he struggled to his feet, leaning on a piece of driftwood for support, Tund noticed something odd. Footprints. Not his own, but a trail of them, leading from the beach into the forest. His heart raced. Someone else was here. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse and dry. "Is anyone there?" No answer. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant cry of a bird. Still, Tund couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The footprints were fresh. Whoever had made them couldn't be far. Against his better judgment, he followed the trail. Every step felt heavy, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The forest was thick, the trees towering over him like silent guardians. He pushed through the undergrowth, branches scratching at his arms and face, until he reached a small clearing. A group of women stood in a semicircle, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. They were dressed in simple clothes, skirts and blouses that looked handmade, but each held a weapon. Spears, machetes, and even sharpened sticks. Their eyes were locked on him, wide with fear and anger. Tund froze. His mouth went dry. "Who are you?" one of them demanded. She was tall and slender, with a commanding presence that made it clear she was in charge. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. I'm Tund," he stammered, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "I was in a boat. There was a storm. I don't even know where I am." The women exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Tund could feel their distrust like a weight pressing down on him. He wanted to explain, to reassure them, but he didn't know how. What could he say that wouldn't make things worse? "Search him," the leader said, and two women stepped forward cautiously. They patted him down, their movements quick and efficient, before stepping back. "He's unarmed," one of them reported, though her tone suggested she didn't trust him any more than the others. "Please," Tund said, his voice cracking. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I don't even know how I got here. The leader's eyes narrowed. Why should we believe you? Men don't just show up here by accident. Tund frowned, confused. What do you mean? Where is here? None of your concern, she snapped. Then, turning to the others, she added, take him back to the village. We'll decide what to do with him there. Before Tund could protest, two of the women grabbed his arms and began marching him deeper into the forest. He didn't resist. He was too weak, too confused, and frankly, too scared. All he could do was hope that wherever they were taking him, it wasn't somewhere worse than this. The village was hidden in the heart of the forest, a collection of simple huts made from wood and palm leaves. There was a small garden with rows of vegetables, a freshwater stream running nearby, and a fire pit in the center surrounded by stones. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. As Tund was dragged into the clearing, more women emerged from the huts, their faces mirroring the suspicion he'd seen earlier. They gathered around, whispering among themselves, their eyes never leaving him. The leader stepped forward again, motioning for the others to be quiet. My name is Zara, she said, her tone firm but calm. I am the leader here. If you want to stay alive, you'll answer my questions honestly. Do you understand? Tund nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Good. Now, tell me everything. Who are you? Why are you here? And how did you find us? Tund took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. My name is Tund Alabi. I'm a journalist. I was investigating a trafficking ring when my boat capsized in a storm. I woke up on the beach and followed the footprints here. I didn't know anyone was here. I swear. Zara studied him, her expression unreadable. A journalist, she said slowly, as if testing the word. And what do you know about trafficking? I know it's destroying lives, Tund replied, his voice gaining strength. I've been working to expose the people behind it. That's why I was on the boat. I wanted to find evidence, to bring them down. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Zara silenced it with a raised hand. And now you expect us to believe that you just happened to wash up on this island? Do you think we're fools? Tund shook his head. No, Enough, Zara interrupted. You've said your piece. Now we'll decide what to do with you. She turned to the others, speaking in a low voice Tund couldn't hear. He stood there, helpless, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him. Whatever decision they made, he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer in his hands. Tund sat on the hard floor of the hut, his hands tied loosely in front of him. The ropes didn't hurt, but they were tight enough to remind him that he wasn't free. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who were these women? Why were they here? And why did they seem so angry and scared of him? He didn't have any answers, but he knew one thing. If he didn't handle this situation carefully, things could go very wrong. The door creaked open, and Zara walked in. Her face was calm, but her sharp eyes didn't miss a thing. Behind her, two other women entered, one holding a wooden spear and the other carrying a bowl of water. Zara motioned for the guard to stay by the door, while the woman with the bowl placed it in front of Tund. Drink, Zara said flatly. Tund hesitated, unsure if he should trust her. It's water, she added, her tone impatient. If we wanted to hurt you, we wouldn't waste time with poison. Tund nodded and leaned forward, sipping the cool water with shaky hands. Tasted fresh, almost sweet, and he realized just how thirsty he was. He drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Thank you, he said, looking up at Zara. She didn't respond. Instead, she pulled a stool from the corner of the hut and sat down, crossing her arms. Now talk. I already told you everything I know, Tund said quickly. I was investigating a trafficking ring. My boat capsized in a storm. I didn't know anyone lived here. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. Zara tilted her head slightly, studying him. You expect me to believe you washed up here by accident? This island isn't exactly on the way to anywhere. Tund shook his head. I swear it's the truth. I don't even know where here is. I just followed the footprints I saw on the beach. I thought they might lead to help. At this, Zara leaned forward. Help? From who? Men like the ones you claim to be investigating. No. Tun's voice rose, but he caught himself and softened his tone. No, I'm not like them. I'm trying to stop them. I'm on your side. Our side, Zara repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. You don't even know who we are. Tund hesitated. Then tell me. Zara's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence in the hut was heavy, broken only by the faint sounds of birds chirping outside. Finally, she spoke. We're survivors. That's all you need to know. Survivors of what? Tund asked gently. Zara didn't answer. Instead, she rose from her seat and turned to leave. We'll see how much of your story holds up. For now, stay here. Don't try anything stupid. Wait, Tund called after her. Please, Zara. I'm not your enemy. She paused at the door, her back to him. Prove it. And then she was gone, leaving Tund alone with the guard, who stood silent and unmoving by the door. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Tund couldn't tell. The shadows in the hut grew longer as the sun began to set. He sat quietly, replaying Zara's words in his head. Survivors. What had they survived? He thought about the traffickers he had been chasing. Could these women be connected to them somehow? The thought made his stomach twist. The door opened again, and this time, a different woman entered. She was younger, with soft features and a gentle smile that seemed out of place in such a tense situation. She carried a small tray of food, rice, beans, and a slice of yam, and set it down in front of Tund. Eat, she said softly, kneeling beside him. You'll need your strength. Thank you, Tund said, his voice cautious but grateful. He picked up the food with his hands, too hungry to care about manners, and began eating. The woman watched him for a moment, then said, I'm Ada. Tund, he replied between bites. I know, she said with a small smile. Everyone knows your name now. Tund chuckled dryly. Not the best first impression, I'm guessing. Ada's smile faded, and she looked down at her hands. They're scared of you. We all are. Tund stopped eating and frowned. Why? I haven't done anything. Ada sighed. It's not you exactly. It's what you represent. The outside world. Men. Danger. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Tund said firmly. I just want to understand. What happened to you? Why are you all here? Ada hesitated, glancing toward the door as if to make sure no one was listening. It's not my story to tell, she said finally. But I can tell you this much. We were taken. All of us. From different places, different lives. And when we escaped, we found this island. It became our home, our safe place. Taken by who? Tund asked, though he already suspected the answer. Ada's eyes hardened. Traffickers. Men who saw us as nothing more than property. Tund felt a surge of anger, not at Ada, but at the world that had allowed this to happen. I'm so sorry, he said quietly. Ada nodded, her expression softening. We don't need your pity, Tund. We've built something here, something good. But it's fragile. That's why Zara is so protective. She has to be. I get it, Tund said. But I'm not here to break what you've built. I want to help. Ada gave him a long, searching look. Then you need to show them that. Actions speak louder than words. Before Tund could respond, the door opened again, and Zara stepped inside. Her eyes darted to Ada, who quickly stood and backed away. Zara's gaze shifted to Tund. Time to meet the others, she said. Let's see if you're as good with people as you claim to be. The village was bustling as Zara led Tund to the center of the clearing. Women of all ages were gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and fear. Some held tools or weapons, while others stood with their arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen. Zara raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. This is Tund, she announced, her voice carrying authority. He says he's a journalist investigating traffickers. He claims he ended up here by accident. Now it's up to us to decide if we believe him, or if he's a threat. The murmurs began immediately, voices overlapping as the women debated among themselves. One voice cut through the noise. Why should we trust him? It was Bimp, a tall woman with a scar running down her cheek. Her eyes burned with anger. Men like him are the reason we're here in the first place. I'm not like them, Tund said, stepping forward. I've spent years trying to expose people like them. I want to bring them to justice. Bimp's laugh was bitter. Justice? What good is that to us? We're here because justice failed. She's right, another woman said. How do we know he's not one of them? A spy sent to find us? I'm not a spy, Tund said, his voice rising. I had no idea this island even existed until today. I'm just trying to survive, like all of you. And what happens when he leaves? Kike, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, stepped forward. What if he tells others about us? Brings them here? Can we take that risk? I wouldn't do that, Tund said quickly. I'd never betray you. Enough, Zara said sharply, silencing the crowd. She turned to Tund. You say you're here by accident, that you want to help. Fine, but words aren't enough. You'll prove yourself through actions. Starting tomorrow, Tund frowned. What do you mean? You'll work, Zara said simply. Earn your place here. Show us that you're not a threat. If you can do that, maybe we'll consider trusting you. Tund nodded slowly. Fair enough. Zara's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned to the crowd. Until then, he stays under guard. No exceptions. The crowd murmured in agreement, though some still looked uneasy. Tund felt the weight of their stares as Zara motioned for the guards to take him back to the hut. As they led him away, he caught Ada's eye. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, and for the first time since he arrived, Tund felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. He had to survive. Not just for himself, but for them. For all of them. The sun was barely up when Zara stormed into the hut where Tund had spent the night. Her footsteps were quick and sharp, and her voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. Get up, she ordered. Today you work. Tund, still half asleep and stiff from the hard floor, blinked at her. He had barely closed his eyes before Zara's voice jolted him awake again. What, now? Can I at least get some water first? Zara didn't smile. Water is earned. Let's see what you're worth before you start making demands. She stepped aside, motioning for him to follow. Two women stood at the doorway, spears in hand, their eyes as cold as the morning breeze. They weren't taking any chances with him. Tund was led to a small clearing in the village where a group of women was already working. Some were digging in the dirt, planting crops, while others carried heavy baskets filled with fruits and roots. The air smelled of earth and sweat, and the sound of tools striking the ground filled the space. Zara pointed to a patch of overgrown weeds. Start there, she said. Clear the land. Use this. She handed him a rusty machete, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Tund looked at the machete, then at the thick tangle of weeds in front of him. All of this? By myself. Yes, Zara said simply. Unless you'd prefer to go hungry tonight. He sighed and nodded, gripping the machete tightly. Fine. Let's get to it. The work was harder than he expected. The weeds were stubborn, their roots tangled deep in the soil. Sweat poured down his face as he hacked and pulled, the muscles in his arms burning with every swing. The women nearby glanced at him occasionally, some with curiosity, others with barely hidden skepticism. As Tund worked, a familiar voice broke through the sounds of labor. You're doing it wrong. He turned to see Ada standing a few feet away, holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables. She was smiling, though there was a hint of mischief in her eyes. What do you mean I'm doing it wrong? Tund asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. I'm cutting the weeds, aren't I? Ada set down her basket and walked over, taking the machete from his hands. It's not just about cutting. You have to dig out the roots or they'll grow back. Like this, she demonstrated, stabbing the machete into the ground at an angle and pulling up a clump of weeds, roots and all. Great, Tund muttered, shaking his head. As if this wasn't hard enough already, Ada laughed. It's not so bad once you get the hang of it. Here, I'll help. He looked at her, surprised. You don't have to. I know, she said, cutting him off. But if you keep doing it wrong, Zara will have your head. So, let's fix this before she notices. They worked together for the next hour, clearing the patch of land bit by bit. Ada was patient, showing Tund how to use the machete more effectively and how to spot the toughest roots. As they worked, they talked. So Ada said, glancing at him, "What's it like? The outside world, I mean." Tund paused, leaning on the machete. "It's complicated. Some parts are good, some parts are bad. It's noisy, crowded, and messy. But it's home." Ada nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I used to dream about leaving the village where I grew up. I thought the world out there would be better, bigger." "It is," Tund said, "but it's also dangerous. People can be cruel." Ada looked down at the ground. "I know. That's why we stay here. It's safer." Tund wanted to say more, to argue that hiding wasn't the answer, but he stopped himself. He didn't know enough about what they had been through to judge their choices. By midday, Tund's arms felt like jelly, but the patch of land was clear. Zara returned, her expression as unreadable as ever. She inspected the work, running her fingers through the freshly turned soil. "Not bad," she said finally. "Better than I expected." "Thanks, I guess," Tund said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Glad I could impress you." Zara ignored his tone. "You'll join the builders tomorrow. For now, rest. And don't wander." With that, she walked away, leaving Tund alone. He sank to the ground, exhausted but strangely satisfied. He had survived his first day. The next morning, Tund was taken to a different part of the village, where a group of women was working on a wooden structure. It looked like a storage shed, its frame half-finished. One of the women, a tall, broad-shouldered builder named Amina, handed him a hammer and a handful of nails. "You know how to use these?" she asked, her tone more curious than judgmental. Tund nodded. "I've done a bit of carpentry. Not much, but enough." "Good," Amina said. "We'll see if you're telling the truth. Start with that beam over there." Tund got to work, hammering nails into the wooden frame. It was easier than clearing weeds, but still required focus and precision. Amina watched him for a while, then nodded approvingly. "Not bad," she said. "At least you're not useless." "Thanks," Tund said, grinning. "High praise coming from you." Amina smirked but said nothing. As they worked, Tund noticed a group of women nearby, whispering and glancing in his direction. One of them, a wiry woman with a scar on her cheek, didn't bother hiding her glare. It was Bimp. Tund tried to ignore her, but when she walked over, he tensed. "You think you're fooling anyone?" she said, her voice low but sharp. "We all know why you're here." "I'm here because I survived a storm," Tund said, keeping his voice calm. "Same as you. Don't compare yourself to us," Bimp snapped. "You don't belong here." "I'm not trying to take anything from you," Tund said. "I just want to help." Bimp's eyes narrowed. "We don't need your help. We've survived without you, and we'll keep surviving after you're gone." Before Tund could respond, Amina stepped between them. "That's enough, Bimp," she said firmly. "Go back to your work." Bimp glared at Tund one last time before walking away, muttering under her breath. Tund let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Don't mind her," Amina said. "She's had a hard life. We all have." "I get it," Tund said. "But I'm not the enemy." "Prove it," Amina said simply. "That's the only way you'll change her mind." Tund settled into a routine. He worked alongside the women, helping with whatever tasks needed to be done. Some of them warmed up to him, like Ada and Amina, while others, like Bimp, kept their distance. Zara remained as guarded as ever, watching him closely but saying little. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tund sat by the fire with Ada and a few others. The conversation was light, filled with laughter and stories about their lives before the island. For a moment, Tund felt like he belonged. But as he looked around, he noticed Zara standing at the edge of the clearing, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on him. It was a reminder that no matter how much progress he made, he was still an outsider. And trust, he realized, would not come easily. Tund sat on a log near the edge of the village, sharpening a stick that Amina had given him to use as a tool. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. He could hear the faint chatter of the women in the distance as they prepared for the evening meal. For a brief moment, he felt at ease, as if the tensions of the past few days were finally beginning to fade. That peace didn't last long. "Tund!" Zara's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. He looked up to see her striding toward him, her face hard as stone. Behind her was Bimp, and from the tight line of her mouth, Tund could tell this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. "What's going on?" Tund asked, standing up. Zara stopped a few feet from him, crossing her arms. "Bimp says you've been sneaking around." Tund blinked, caught off guard. "Sneaking around? What are you talking about?" Bimp stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "I saw you near the eastern edge of the forest yesterday. What were you doing there?" Tund frowned, trying to remember. "I was gathering firewood. Amina asked me to help." "That's it. You're lying," Bimp snapped. "I saw you looking at the ground, poking around like you were searching for something." "I was looking for dry wood," Tund said, his voice rising. "What else would I be looking for?" "That's what we want to know," Zara said, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. "Why were you there, Tund? Be honest." Tund threw his hands up in frustration. "I already told you. I wasn't doing anything wrong. You can ask Amina. She'll tell you." Zara's gaze didn't waver. "Amina isn't here. I'm asking you." "I don't know what you want me to say," Tund said, his tone exasperated. "I'm trying to help, but no matter what I do, some of you keep treating me like I'm the enemy. Maybe because you are." Bimp shot back. "Men like you." "Stop it," Ada's voice interrupted, startling everyone. She hurried over, her face flushed with anger. "Bimp, leave him alone. You've been looking for a reason to hate him since the day he got here." "I don't need a reason," Bimp retorted. "I've seen enough to know what he's like." "You don't know anything about him," Ada said sharply. "And you don't get to keep accusing him without proof." Zara raised a hand, silencing both of them. "Enough. This isn't helping." Tund took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Look, Zara, I know you don't trust me, but I haven't done anything to deserve this. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to survive, same as you." Zara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "We'll talk to Amina. Until then, stay in the village. Don't go wandering." Tund nodded, relieved. "Fine. Whatever you say." Bimp shot him a final glare before stomping off. Ada stayed behind, giving Tund a reassuring smile. "Don't let her get to you," she said softly. "She's just scared." "Scared of what?" Tund asked. Ada hesitated. "Of the past. Of what we left behind." As Tund sat by the fire eating his meal, he noticed Zara speaking quietly with a small group of women. Their faces were serious, and they glanced in his direction more than once. He knew they were talking about him, but he didn't have the energy to care. He was too tired, both physically and mentally, to deal with more accusations. Ada sat down beside him, breaking the heavy silence. "You did good today," she said, nudging him with her elbow. Tund chuckled weakly. "Did I? Feels like all I did was make things worse." "You stood your ground," Ada said. "That's something." "Doesn't feel like it," Tund muttered. He stared into the flames, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the chill in his chest. "I don't think they'll ever trust me." Ada was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Trust takes time, but some of them will come around." "I know they will." Tund glanced at her, grateful for her kindness. "Thanks, Ada. I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You'd manage. You're stronger than you think." The next morning, Zara called a meeting in the center of the village. The entire community gathered, their voices hushed as they waited for her to speak. Tund stood at the edge of the crowd, unsure of what was happening. "There's something we need to discuss," Zara began, her tone serious. "Tund has been with us for several days now. Some of you believe he's here to help. Others think he's a threat. We need to decide where we stand." A murmur ran through the crowd, the tension thick in the air. Zara raised a hand, silencing them. This isn't about taking sides. It's about what's best for all of us. If we can't agree, we risk tearing ourselves apart. Amina stepped forward, her voice firm. I've worked with Tund. He's done nothing but help since he got here. I think we should give him a chance. I agree, Ada said, stepping beside Amina. He's proven himself more than once. We can't keep punishing him for things he hasn't done. Bimp pushed her way to the front, her face hard. You're all blind. He's lying to us. He's only here because he wants something. I say we get rid of him before it's too late. The crowd erupted in debate, voices overlapping as everyone tried to make themselves heard. Tund felt the weight of their words pressing down on him, his chest tightening with frustration. Enough! Zara shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. This isn't helping. She turned to Tund, her eyes piercing. You say you're here to help. Prove it. Do something that shows us you can be trusted. Tund hesitated, unsure of what to say. What do you want me to do? Find something we need, Zara said. Food, water, anything. Show us you're not just taking up space. Tund nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. Bimp scoffed. This is a mistake. We'll see, Zara said, her gaze never leaving Tund. You have until tomorrow. As Tund prepared to leave the village, Ada found him near the edge of the forest. Be careful, she said, her voice filled with concern. I will, Tund said. Thanks, Ada. She handed him a small bag of supplies. Take this. It's not much, but it'll help. Tund smiled, touched by her kindness. You're a lifesaver. Just don't prove me wrong, Ada said with a teasing smile. But there was an edge of worry in her tone that she couldn't hide. As Tund stepped into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. If he could bring back something useful, maybe, just maybe, he could finally earn their trust. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The forest felt different at night. The towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching long and jagged under the dim moonlight. Tund moved carefully, each step deliberate, the bag Ada had given him slung over his shoulder. He knew the stakes were high. If he returned to the village empty-handed, he'd lose whatever small support he'd managed to gain. He pushed a low-hanging branch out of his way and paused, taking in the sounds around him. The forest was alive. Chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But beneath it all, there was something else. A feeling he couldn't shake, like he wasn't alone. Tund stopped in a small clearing and pulled out a bottle of water from Ada's bag. As he drank, he thought about the women in the village. Ada, who had been kind from the start. Amina, who respected his hard work. And Zara, who seemed to carry the weight of the entire community on her shoulders. Then there was Bimp, her words ringing in his ears. He's lying to us. He wants something. He sighed, capping the bottle. What could I possibly want from them? He muttered under his breath. I'm just trying to stay alive. As he turned to continue, something caught his eye. A faint flicker of light in the distance. He froze, staring at it. It wasn't the moonlight. It was too low to the ground and too steady. Fire? He hesitated, weighing his options. The light could mean danger, but it could also lead to answers. If it was someone else on the island, he needed to know. Tightening his grip on the stick he carried for protection, he made his way toward the glow. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the light was coming from a fire. He slowed his steps, crouching behind a thick tree trunk. Peeking around the edge, he saw what he had feared. A camp. A small fire crackled in the middle of a makeshift clearing. Around it were remnants of crates and equipment, the kind used for transporting goods or people. There were no signs of anyone nearby, but the scene was enough to make Tund's stomach turn. The traffickers. They'd been here. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. Most of the crates were empty, but a few still had labels scrawled in hurried handwriting. He couldn't make out all the words, but one name stood out. Ishaku Trading Company. Tund frowned. He'd seen that name before, in the documents he'd collected during his investigation back on the mainland. Ishaku Trading was one of the shell companies the traffickers used to hide their activities. If the crates were here, It meant the traffickers had been operating on this island at some point. But when? And were they still here? He bent down to examine a rusted metal container, but a sudden noise behind him made him whip around, his stick raised defensively. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The bushes rustled, and a figure stepped into the firelight. It was Zara. Tund let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Zara, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Zara said, her voice sharp. Her eyes flicked to the crates, her expression hardening. "What is this?" "I was about to ask you that," Tund said, lowering his stick. "I found this place by accident. I think it's connected to the traffickers." Zara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the area. Her jaw tightened as she took in the crates, the fire, and the equipment scattered around. This shouldn't be here. "You didn't know about this?" Tund asked, surprised. "No," Zara said firmly. "If I had, I would have destroyed it." Tund frowned. "Then someone's been hiding it. Maybe even using it." Zara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And you just stumbled on it? How convenient." Tund groaned. "Are we really doing this again?" "I'm not your enemy, Zara. I'm trying to help." Zara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up a small metal tag from one of the crates and studied it. "These crates are old. At least a few years." "Then maybe the traffickers aren't here anymore," Tund said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Maybe," Zara said quietly, but her eyes said something else. She wasn't convinced either. They returned to the village just before dawn. Zara immediately called a meeting, her voice carrying urgency. The women gathered quickly, their faces a mix of confusion and concern as Zara explained what they had found. "This camp was hidden in the eastern forest," Zara said, holding up the metal tag. "It belonged to the traffickers. We don't know how long it's been there, but we can't ignore the possibility that they might come back." The crowd murmured, the fear in their voices palpable. "What do we do?" Amina asked, stepping forward. "If they find us..." "They won't," Zara said firmly. "We'll destroy the camp and cover our tracks. They won't find a trace of us." "Shouldn't we leave?" one of the younger women asked. "Find somewhere safer?" "And go where?" Bimp said, her voice sharp. "This is our home now. We're not running again." "But what if they're already on the island?" Ada asked, her voice trembling. "What if they're watching us?" The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Zara turned to Tund. "What do you think?" Tund blinked, surprised. It was the first time Zara had asked for his opinion in front of everyone. He chose his words carefully. "I think we need to be prepared for anything. If the traffickers are still here, we need a plan to defend ourselves. And if they're not?" Bimp challenged, folding her arms. "Then what?" "Then we've lost nothing by being ready," Tund said simply. "It's better to be safe than sorry." Zara nodded, seeming satisfied. "All right, Amina, Tund, and I will go back to the camp and destroy what's left. The rest of you will stay here and fortify the village. If anyone sees or hears anything unusual, alert me immediately." The women murmured their agreement, though the fear in their eyes was still evident. Tund glanced at Ada, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. He hoped she was right to trust him. Back at the camp, Tund worked alongside Zara and Amina to dismantle the crates and burn the equipment. The fire crackled and roared as they fed it with wood and broken pieces of machinery. The smell of smoke filled the air, thick and choking. "This should have been done years ago," Zara muttered, tossing a wooden plank into the flames. "Better late than never," Tund said, wiping sweat from his brow. Amina glanced at him. "You really think the traffickers are gone?" "I hope they are," Tund said. "But hope isn't enough. We have to assume the worst." Zara nodded, her expression grim. "Agreed. If they come back, we'll be ready." They worked in silence for the next few hours, the fire consuming the remnants of the traffickers' presence. As they finished, Zara turned to Tund. "You did well," she said, her tone softer than usual. Tund raised an eyebrow. "Was that a compliment?" "Don't get used to it," Zara said, though there was a hint of a smile on her lips. When they returned to the village, the atmosphere was tense but organized. The women had reinforced the perimeter with sharpened stakes and hidden traps, and patrols were set up to keep watch through the night. For the first time, Tund felt like he was truly part of their community. But as he lay down to rest that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The traffickers might not be on the island now, but the crates were a reminder that their shadow still loomed large. And if they ever returned, Tund knew the fight would be unlike anything they'd faced before. The air in the village felt heavy the next morning. Tund noticed it as soon as he stepped out of the hut. The usual hum of conversation and the sounds of work were muted, replaced by quiet whispers and glances that spoke of unease. Zara stood in the center of the clearing, speaking in low tones to Amina and a few others. Her face was calm, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her worry. Tund approached cautiously, nodding at Amina before turning to Zara. "What's going on?" he asked. Zara didn't look at him immediately. When she did, her eyes were sharp and focused. "One of the patrols saw something near the southern edge of the forest," she said. "Tracks, fresh ones." "Tracks?" Tund repeated, his chest tightening. "Are you sure they're not from one of us?" Amina shook her head. "We checked. They're not ours. They're too big, too deep. Whoever made them was carrying something heavy." For a moment, Tund said nothing, his mind racing. The camp, the crates, and now this, everything was falling into place, and it wasn't good. "They're here," he said finally, his voice low. "The traffickers are back." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Zara nodded grimly. "That's what we think." The women gathered in the clearing, their faces pale but determined. Zara stood at the center, her voice steady as she laid out the plan. "We don't know how many of them there are or what they're looking for, but we can't assume they'll leave us alone. If they find this village, they won't stop until they take what they want. We're not going to let that happen," Amina said, her voice firm. "We've prepared for this. The traps, the defenses, they'll work." Bimp stepped forward, her arms crossed. "And what about him?" she asked, nodding toward Tund. "What's his role in all this?" Tund sighed, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "I'm here to help, like I've been doing since the day I got here. You don't have to trust me, but I'm not going to sit back while people get hurt." Bimp didn't respond, but the look on her face said she wasn't convinced. Zara cut through the tension with a sharp gesture. "We don't have time for this. Everyone has a role. Tund, you'll work with Amina to reinforce the traps on the eastern side. Ada, you'll lead a patrol to keep watch for any movement. The rest of you know what to do." The women nodded, their fear replaced by determination. Tund caught Ada's eye as she passed him, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. It was a brief moment of comfort in an otherwise tense situation. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Tund and Amina worked side by side, checking and resetting the traps they had set days earlier. Sharpened stakes were buried in the ground, hidden beneath leaves and branches. Nets were strung up in the trees, ready to be released with a single pull. It was hard, exhausting work, but Tund didn't complain. He knew what was at stake. As they worked, Amina glanced at him. "You seem calm," she said. "Most people would be panicking right now." Tund chuckled dryly. "Trust me, I'm panicking on the inside. I'm just good at hiding it." Amina smiled faintly. "You've been through stuff like this before, haven't you? Back on the mainland?" "Not exactly," Tund admitted. "But I've seen what people like them can do. I know how far they're willing to go to get what they want." Amina nodded, her expression darkening. "So do we." They fell into silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Tund wanted to ask more about her past, about what she and the others had endured, but he didn't. Now wasn't the time. By nightfall, the village was quiet. Too quiet. The women stayed close to their huts, their eyes darting toward the edges of the clearing at every small sound. Tund sat by the fire with Zara and Amina, going over the plan one last time. "If they come, we'll funnel them toward the traps," Zara said, her finger tracing a line in the dirt. "The eastern side is the most vulnerable, so that's where we'll focus our defenses. Ada's patrol will warn us if they get too close." "And if they make it past the traps?" Tund asked. Zara's jaw tightened. Then we fight. The fire crackled, the sound filling the heavy silence that followed her words. Tund nodded. All right, let's hope it doesn't come to that. The attack came just before dawn. Tund was jolted awake by the sound of shouting. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the sharpened stick he kept by his side. Outside, the village was in chaos. Women were running in all directions, their voices rising in panic as the first gunshot rang out. "They're here," someone yelled. "The traffickers are here." Tund's heart pounded as he ran toward the eastern side of the village. The traps had been triggered, and the ground was littered with fallen branches and tangled nets. A group of men, armed with machetes and rifles, was trying to cut their way through. "Fall back," Zara shouted, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Draw them in." The women moved quickly, retreating toward the center of the village as the traffickers advanced. Tund joined Amina near one of the traps, helping her reset it while keeping an eye on the approaching men. "They're more organized than I expected," Amina muttered, her hands moving quickly. "This isn't just a random attack. They're here for something specific," Tund said, his voice grim. "Or someone." The thought sent a chill down his spine. He didn't want to think about what would happen if the traffickers got their hands on any of the women. He tightened his grip on the stick and stepped forward, positioning himself between the advancing men and the trap. The fight that followed was chaotic and brutal. The traffickers pushed through the traps, but the women fought back with everything they had. Spears, knives, even sharpened sticks were used to drive the men back. Tund found himself in the thick of it, swinging his stick at anything that moved. At one point, he came face to face with one of the traffickers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his neck. The man lunged at him with a machete, but Tund sidestepped and swung his stick, catching the man in the side. The trafficker stumbled, and Tund didn't hesitate, hitting him again until he fell. Breathing heavily, Tund looked around. The women were holding their ground, but the traffickers weren't giving up. He spotted Zara and Amina fighting side by side, their movements coordinated and fierce. Even Ada was in the thick of it, her face set with determination as she swung a club at one of the men. "Zara!" Tund shouted, running toward her. "We need to push them back before more come." "I know," Zara yelled, her voice strained. "Hold the line. We can't let them into the village." The battle raged on for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. Slowly, the women began to gain the upper hand. The traps, the element of surprise, and their sheer determination proved to be too much for the traffickers. One by one, the men began to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. When the last of them disappeared into the forest, the village fell silent. The women stood in the clearing, their faces and clothes smeared with dirt and blood. Zara stepped forward, her chest heaving as she surveyed the scene. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. There were murmurs of agreement, though a few women had minor injuries. Ada moved among them, tending to cuts and bruises with a calm efficiency that belied the fear still lingering in her eyes. Tund sank to the ground, his stick falling from his hands. His arms ached, his head was spinning, but they had done it. They had survived. Zara crouched beside him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You did good," she said quietly. Tund managed a weak smile. "So did you." For the first time since he arrived on the island, he felt like he truly belonged. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The traffickers would regroup. They would come back. And when they did, the fight would be even harder. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The village was eerily quiet after the battle. Smoke curled up from the charred remains of traps and weapons. The women moved in slow, careful steps, tending to wounds, repairing damage, and gathering what little energy they had left. Tund sat by the fire, wrapping a piece of cloth around a gash on his arm. His hands trembled, though he wasn't sure if it was from pain, exhaustion, or the lingering fear of what had just happened. Zara approached, her face streaked with dirt and her braid undone. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, part gratitude, part suspicion. How bad is it? She asked, nodding toward his arm. I'll live, Tund said, tying the cloth tighter. How's everyone else? Some cuts and bruises, Zara replied, sitting down across from him. Nothing we can't handle. Thanks to you. Tund shook his head. It wasn't just me. Everyone fought like warriors out there. If they hadn't... He trailed off, the thought of what could have happened too much to finish. Zara studied him for a moment before speaking. You were right. The traffickers weren't just here by chance. They knew about this place. How? Tund asked. The island isn't exactly easy to find. Zara hesitated, then glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. There's something I haven't told you, she said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone. Tund leaned forward, his voice low. What is it? Zara's voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with guilt. When we escaped from the traffickers, we weren't alone. There was a woman with us, Miriam. She was one of their informants. Tund's brow furrowed. An informant? You mean she was working with them? Zara nodded. She pretended to be one of us, but she was feeding them information. We didn't realize it until it was too late. She led them right to us before we got away. Did she escape with you? Tund asked. No, Zara said firmly. She tried to sabotage us during the storm. We fought her off and she didn't make it. At least that's what we thought. Tund's chest tightened. You think she survived? I don't know, Zara admitted. But if she did, she would have told them about this island. Tund rubbed his forehead, trying to process what he was hearing. If she's alive, she's dangerous. And if she's the reason they're here... Zara's jaw clenched. Then we have to find her before she finds us. The next day, Zara called a meeting in the center of the village. The women gathered, their faces still marked with the exhaustion of the battle. Tund stood beside Zara, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. We need to talk about what happened, Zara began, her voice steady. The traffickers found us. That much is clear. But what's not clear is how. A murmur ran through the crowd, the women exchanging uneasy glances. Ada stepped forward, her face pale but determined. You think someone told them? It's possible, Zara said. Years ago, we escaped with someone who wasn't on our side. She betrayed us once before. If she's alive, she could be the reason they're here now. Why didn't you tell us this before? Bimp demanded, her voice sharp. We should have known. I didn't think it mattered anymore, Zara said, meeting Bimp's glare. We thought she was gone. But now I'm not so sure. What do we do? Amina asked, breaking the tense silence. We go back to the camp, Zara said. Search for any clues about how they found us. If Miriam is alive, we'll find proof there. And if she's not? Ada asked. Then we figure out how to stop them from coming back, Zara said firmly. Tund joined the search party that headed back to the traffickers' camp. It was smaller this time, just Zara, Amina, Ada, and himself. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every shadow and every rustle of leaves. The forest felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. When they reached the camp, the sight made Tund's stomach turn. The crates and equipment were still there, though charred and broken from their earlier raid. But now there were fresh footprints, boot prints leading in and out of the clearing. They've been back, Amina said, her voice tight. Recently, Zara nodded. Spread out. Look for anything that might tell us what they're planning. Tund moved toward a pile of broken crates, his stick held tightly in his hand. He sifted through the debris, his heart pounding as he uncovered a torn piece of paper. It was weathered and stained, but the writing on it was still legible. Transport schedule, Ishaku Trading. He called Zara over, holding up the paper. Look at this. Zara took it, her eyes narrowing as she read. This is a schedule. They're planning another shipment. Shipment of what? Amina asked, stepping closer. People, Tund said grimly. That's what they do. Ada's face paled. They're still trafficking people? Even after all this? They never stopped, Zara said, her voice hard. But this schedule, it means they're using this island as part of their route. Which means they'll be back, Tund said. Zara nodded. folding the paper and tucking it into her belt. We need to prepare. And we need to warn the others. When they returned to the village, Zara gathered everyone once again. The tension in the air was palpable as she explained what they had found. The traffickers are planning another shipment, she said, and they're using this island as part of their route. If we don't stop them, they'll come back. And next time, they'll come in force. We have to fight, Amina said, her voice steady. We can't let them take this place from us. But how? Ada asked. We barely survived the last attack. What if they bring more men? Then we'll bring more traps, Tund said, stepping forward. We'll make it so dangerous for them that they won't dare come back. Bimp crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. And what if they don't scare that easily? Then we fight, Zara said, her voice firm. With everything we have. As the village prepared for what was to come, Tund found himself sitting by the fire with Ada. She was quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You okay? Tund asked, his voice gentle. Ada shook her head. No, I'm scared. Me too, Tund admitted. But we'll get through this. We have to. Ada looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What if we don't? What if this is the end? Tund reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's not. We've come this far, and we're not giving up now. Ada nodded, her lips trembling as she smiled faintly. Thank you, Tund, for being here. Tund smiled back. I'm just doing what I can. Same as you. As the fire crackled between them, Tund felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. For now, that was all that mattered. The night before the final confrontation, the village was quiet. Too quiet. Tund sat near the fire, staring into the flames as he went over the plan in his head. Around him, the women worked in pairs, sharpening weapons, resetting traps, and securing the perimeter. Each movement was purposeful, yet there was an underlying tension in the air. They all knew what was coming. Ada approached and sat beside him, holding a small bowl of roasted yams. She handed it to him without a word. Thanks, Tund said, taking the bowl. He broke a piece off and chewed slowly, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. How's everyone holding up? They're scared, Ada admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But they're ready. We have to be. Tund nodded. It's not just about survival anymore. This is about taking a stand. Ada glanced at him, her eyes filled with worry. Do you think we can win? Tund hesitated, then nodded. We don't have a choice. If we don't fight back, they'll keep coming. Not just here, but everywhere. Ada looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. I wish we didn't have to do this. So do I, Tund said softly. But sometimes, standing up is the only option. As dawn broke, the village was alive with activity. Zara stood at the center of the clearing, her voice steady as she gave orders. Everyone knows their roles. Stick to the plan, and don't take unnecessary risks. We've prepared for this. Trust each other. The women nodded, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Amina stepped forward, adjusting the spear in her hand. We've got this, she said, her voice strong. They don't know who they're messing with. Tund moved to Zara's side, holding the makeshift weapon he'd spent the night sharpening. What's the first move? We wait, Zara said. Ada's patrol will signal us when they're close. Until then, we hold our ground. Tund nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. Let's hope the traps do their job. They will, Zara said firmly. But the tension in her jaw betrayed her own doubts. The signal came just before midday. A loud, sharp whistle echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. Ada and her group burst into the clearing, their faces pale but determined. They're coming, Ada shouted. At least 10 of them, maybe more. Zara raised her hand, signaling everyone to take their positions. The women moved quickly, disappearing into the trees and bushes, their weapons at the ready. Tund crouched behind a pile of rocks near the eastern edge, his heart pounding as he waited. The first trafficker appeared moments later. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a machete in one hand and a rifle slung across his back. He scanned the clearing, his eyes narrowed, before motioning for the others to follow. Tund held his breath as more men emerged from the forest. They moved cautiously, their steps deliberate as they approached the village. One of them muttered something under his breath, but the words were lost in the tension-filled silence. Now Zara's voice rang out. The first trap was triggered with a snap. A net dropped from the trees, entangling two of the traffickers and pulling them off their feet. They shouted in surprise, struggling against the ropes, but the women were ready. Amina and Bimp rushed forward, their spears raised, and took them down before they could free themselves. The remaining traffickers reacted quickly, raising their weapons and shouting commands. But the women didn't give them a chance to regroup. More traps were triggered, pits hidden beneath leaves, spikes rigged to swing from the trees. Chaos erupted as the traffickers tried to fight back. Tund stayed low, waiting for his moment. When one of the men broke through the defenses, charging toward the village with a machete raised, Tund sprang into action. He swung his weapon with all his strength, catching the man across the chest and sending him sprawling. "Nice move," Amina shouted, grinning as she fought off another attacker nearby. "Thanks," Tund called back, his chest heaving as he prepared for the next fight. Despite their preparations, the traffickers weren't easy to defeat. They were well-armed and experienced, and they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The battle stretched on, the clearing filled with the sounds of clashing weapons and shouted orders. At one point, Tund found himself face-to-face with the leader of the group, a scarred man with cold, calculating eyes. The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips, as he raised his rifle. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You're nothing but scared little women." Tund stepped forward, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Maybe, but scared people can still fight." He swung his weapon, but the man dodged, moving with surprising speed. The rifle came up, and Tund barely managed to dive out of the way as a shot rang out. The bullet hit a tree behind him, sending splinters flying. The man laughed, raising the rifle again. But before he could fire, Zara appeared from the side, her spear aimed with precision. She drove it into the man's side, and he dropped with a grunt, clutching the wound. "Good timing," Tund said, breathing heavily as he got to his feet. "Don't get used to it," Zara replied, her eyes scanning the battlefield. "We're not done yet." The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. One by one, the traffickers fell, until the last of them fled into the forest, their shouts fading into the distance. The women stood in the clearing, their weapons lowered but their eyes still sharp, watching for any sign of a counterattack. Tund looked around, his chest heaving. The village was battered, but still standing. The women had done it. They had won. Zara stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the clearing. "Is everyone all right?" There were murmurs of agreement, though a few women were nursing injuries. Ada moved among them, her hands quick and steady as she tended to cuts and bruises. Tund watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "We did it," Amina said, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." Zara nodded, but her expression was grim. "This isn't over. They'll regroup. They'll come back. Then we'll be ready," Tund said, stepping forward. "We've shown them we're not easy targets." "That's a start." Zara looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. "You've proven yourself, Tund. We couldn't have done this without you." Tund smiled faintly. "I just did what I could. Same as everyone else." Later that evening, as the village settled into an uneasy calm, Tund sat by the fire with Ada and Amina. The stars were bright overhead, the sky clear and calm after the storm of the battle. "What now?" Ada asked, her voice quiet. "Now we rebuild," Tund said. "And we keep fighting if we have to. But we don't give up." Ada nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Tund, for everything." Tund smiled, his chest tight with emotion. "No need to thank me. This is my fight too now." As the fire crackled between them, the weight of what they had accomplished settled over them. It wasn't the end, but it was a victory. And for now, that was enough.